I could have your attention, please. We're beginning to start our afternoon session. Halfway through our conference. Maybe a little more than that. Before we introduce the next group, I'd like to announce that once again we will have a photo session at beginning at 5 o'clock. Actually, the photographer will be in here maybe around 4 o'clock. Hopefully it won't be too distracting to you if he's walking around taking pictures of you, looking astounded by all this wonderful information you're going to be hearing this afternoon. Just ignore him, and but immediately at 5 o'clock, those who are parts of groups, it would be appreciated if you were to gather together so we could get some group shots for our archives of this event. And there also will be a cash bar. I believe you all have a couple tickets for at least one drink, maybe two, starting at 5, from 5 to 7, which will be down here at the end of the hall like it was last night. And then at 7 o'clock, the doors will open, and the room will be turned for dinner, and we'll be able to start eating around then. There will be a buffet, so go ahead and help yourselves at that point in time. It should be a wonderful dinner. And then about 8 o'clock or so, depending on how readily we eat, we will have a wonderful evening with Master of Ceremonies, Dr. Pamela Mia Paul, who's now joining us this afternoon. So, and some students, and we're really looking forward to that. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce the Neuromusculoskeletal group, chaired by Dr. Ralph Manchester from the University of Rochester.
Thanks, Chris. We have what I think will be a at least information-packed afternoon planned for you. I hope that will be an interesting bunch of information. The way the neuromusculoskeletal group is put together, you see the list of members on the screen. This afternoon we'll be hearing from Alice Branford-Brenner, Bill Dawson, and Dick Letterman. Dr. Rubin is here in the audience in the back middle and is prepared to respond to rheumatologic issues as they come up. The other member of our group who's unable to be with us is Dr. Mark Hallett, who's actually prepared the written material on focal dystonia, and Dick Letterman will be doing that part of the presentation for him. The agenda is that I'm going to make some introductory comments. Bill Dawson will talk about anatomy and physiology. Alice will talk about musculoskeletal problems. Dick will talk about peripheral nerve problems and the focal dystonia issues. If there are other medical problems that we need to address, we will cover those as well, and then we will summarize and hope to engage you in some conversation about what the next step should be. We have a very exciting audience response part at the end as well. So, to start out with just a few words about the magnitude of neuromusculoskeletal problems among college-level music students. There are fairly good data on this subject, and I'll talk to you just a little bit, and Alice and Dick, I believe, have some more information on magnitude of the problem. I think we're a little bit further ahead with this kind of information around neuromusculoskeletal problems than we might be with some of the other areas we're hearing about at the conference. I think that's mainly because it's a little easier to count these problems, and there's a little bit less stigma attached to having them. So let me give you some idea of where the data suggests we're at in terms of magnitude. These are numbers generated from the institution where I'm at, which historically has not wanted its name mentioned in connection with injuries to students. What you see here on the far right of the slide in the green bar is the overall injury rate that we've measured over a number of years, and it's averaged out to just over 8 injuries per 100 instrumental performance majors per year. So about 8% of the students who are majoring in the performance of an instrument will develop a neuromusculoskeletal problem in any given year. And then the blue and white bars that you see to the left of that break it down by gender. And in keeping with most of the other published studies on the injury rates in musicians and others engaging in repetitive motion in activities, women tend to have a higher injury rate than men, and it's somewhere on the order of 50 to perhaps 100% higher, depending on the various series that you look at. We also have data on the injury rate associated with playing particular instruments. And I know this is a information-packed slide, and I'm not sure how well you can read the legend on the right-hand side that names the various instruments. As with the other presentations, this PowerPoint file will be made available on the website. But what we see here is, starting at the left, the instruments associated with the lowest injury rate, and we're looking here at upper extremity neuromusculoskeletal problems, are the brass instruments. In our series, the horn wins the prize for the lowest injury rate, and the trombone is leading the brass pack, but these are not statistically significant differences among the brass instruments. Then we have slightly higher injury rates associated with playing the woodwind instruments, ranging from oboe in the sort of pink color to flute in the yellow color. But right next to flute, in a slightly different shade of pink, is organ. And at the Eastman School of Music, we have a world-renowned organ program. And it was interesting to find that the injury rate associated with playing the organ in our population turns out to be somewhat lower than the injury rate associated with playing the piano. The next group of instruments are the bowed string instruments. Cello is a lovely shade of blue, and then there's viola, violin, and bass. And I think those of us who take care of musicians with musculoskeletal problems are certainly familiar with seeing string players with problems. Tucked in amongst those 4 string instruments are percussionists. And then the top 3 are piano, guitar, and harp. And in our population, we of course have a large number of piano students, and that's certainly a fairly common occurrence in the clinic to see one of them with an upper extremity problem. Guitar players at the Eastman School, and as I understand it at most places, tend to be primarily male, and harpists tend to be primarily female. So it's interesting to look at the instruments that are associated with the 2 highest injury rates, one being predominantly male, the other predominantly female. Obviously, being male is no ironclad protection against developing a problem. Now, even though these are real data based on students seeking care for a performance-related problem, there are other sources of data that suggest the numbers may be somewhat different, although as you read studies, the devil, or sometimes the key to understanding, is in the details. This is now a study that's been done a few years ago, but was one of the first published pieces of information we had on prevalence rates. What we've been measuring at the Eastman School is incident rates, the number of new cases appearing in a one-year period. It's also important to look at prevalence rates when you go to a defined population and ask at one point in time, are you having a problem? And Hunter Fry did this at Australian music schools back in the mid-'80s and came up with somewhat different numbers with brass players, about 7% of brass players indicating that they were having a problem at any one time, 8% of string players, 9% of keyboard and percussion, 13% of woodwind players. So there are probably some differences in going out and asking musicians if they're having a problem versus counting them when they come in for treatment for a problem that explains some of the differences in these sets of numbers. On the other hand, they're not all that different either. They're in the single-digit percentages to the teens, and I think that indicates the range of the magnitude of the problem. Now, that's how many are having a problem. Another important thing to look at is how long is it lasting and how bad is it? There are several studies on this, and Dick Letterman has published one from his experience seeing musicians in Cleveland. When we looked at the music students who had come in to see us a year after their initial presentation, we found that 70% of them were totally well, were not having any more symptoms, were doing all their required performances, and in some cases weren't paying a whole lot of attention to the changes that we suggested would be helpful. Another 15% were no longer having symptoms and were keeping up with their performance requirements, but were not able to practice with the, shall we say, abandon that they had enjoyed prior to their injury. The unfortunate part was that about 15% still had symptoms that kept them from practicing as much as they needed to meet their ongoing performance requirements. And some of them had actually switched either to a non-performance major or to a non-music major. And this is an area of concern for all of us, I think, if something on the order of 10% of college-level music students, at least the ones who are performance majors, are having a performance-related injury in any given year, and then 15% of them are having long-term problems as a result. Well, you do the math and you say, well, we're only losing 1.5% of students per year, but that's every year that they're in college studying music. And over time, I think that's a higher attrition rate than most of us would like to sustain. So that's a quick overview of the magnitude of the problem. You'll be hearing more about it as we go along this afternoon. Bill Dawson's going to now tell you in less than an hour what we as medical students took most of the first year of medical school to learn.
Okay, third time must be the charm. Thank you. Trying to discuss what Ralph gave me an hour or less to do is very much like trying to discuss God and the universe in 25 words or less, but we'll have a go at it anyway. Actually, in your handouts in the notebook there, the preliminary outline that I had provided some months ago has been somewhat foreshortened because Alice Branfenbrenner is going to be discussing most of what is on the second page of that, which leaves me only about 80% of what I originally scheduled. Actually, what I've done, though, thanks to Chris Chesky's suggestion, is to add a couple of other items to our list today within the length of time. And so I'm really going to be talking about three topics today: basic human anatomy and physiology of the neuromusculoskeletal system. That's actually several systems combined that we would like to have considered as something that our School of Music students will be needing. In addition to that, I also feel that we need to define some common terms that music students and faculty and all musicians really should know. Thirdly, a short section to bring you into some familiarity with the idea that not all problems that music students and musicians in general that they have happened to them are directly related to music. So we're going to talk a little bit about some experience I've had with non-music related difficulties. On to the basics. What portions of the anatomy do we really need to consider? Do our students really need to consider? We need to know about what they are and kind of what they do. And the first, obviously, is muscles. Without muscles, there's no movement, except by just joints flopping in the breeze or in the way of gravity. So we need to have some idea about what muscles are, where they're located, how they work later, that's physiology, but what they do. Each muscle has particular functions, and certain areas need to be considered. Obviously, when we're talking about musculoskeletal injuries, the idea of a harpist getting into difficulty, as Ralph just mentioned, oftentimes is spinal. Leaning to the side while playing, muscle strain of the muscles in the back and neck can be a very significant difficulty. However, as a hand surgeon and as an instrumentalist of a different nature, double reeds, I find that if a person's going to get into difficulty and have come to my office, it's much more likely to be the hand and the upper extremity. And so the muscles that we have here, often in layers. You can notice this particular picture has the idea that muscles do come in layers, one over the top of each other, sticking out a little this way and that way. And in the center of the back, just on either side of the spinal column, the bones of the vertebrae, there are actually 5 or 6 layers of muscles. Now, we don't need to know all of them. I basically forgot about 80% of that after I went into the hand and stopped doing spinal surgery. But music students don't need to know all of these, but to know that they do have certain aspects that are important. Secondly, we'd like to know and learn about tendons, because tendons are what make muscles work at a distance. Tendons are those ropes, those sinewy structures that attach from the fleshy part of a muscle and attach some distance beyond that muscle into a bone or some other structure. And basically, they prolong the activity of the muscle to a more distant point. And they come in a bunch of different sizes. We're seeing a number of them here on the back of the hand, and you can see them on your own hand yourself quite nicely. You can also reach down behind the back of your ankle and feel your Achilles tendon, which is one of the biggest tendons in the body. So a lot of different sizes, a lot of different functions. But tendons need to be discussed as a part of what helps make things move. Thirdly, without joints, there is also no movement, because a joint is where two bones come together, and in most cases, between those two bones, there are structures that allow movement, be it the wrist, be it the finger, be it the multiple joints in the neck that allow flexibility in many directions. But joints are a part of this whole pattern, and again, they all relate to movement. But they should only move certain degrees. I can't make my elbow extend any more than it can right now. Some people can. Some people can get another 15 degrees. But what holds my elbow back from going much farther, besides a little bony protuberance there, are ligaments. Ligaments being, again, a very fibrous, strong band that goes from bone to bone and holds the bones in a certain alignment and allows the bones to move only as far as those ligaments are set up to allow them to move. So they control ranges of movement. Again, we have an ability to move and we have a restriction to move, and we need them both. Now finally, what makes the muscles move? They have to have a nerve supply. Nerves coming down from the neck, as you see in this case, from between the vertebrae of the neck down underneath into the armpit and down the arm, following a very somewhat complicated pattern, but they finally come out to the hand and every area in between, and they provide two different areas of function that we'll talk about very shortly. This is the electrical system. We've been talking about the mobility system before, but we need them both. Let's talk about what muscles do. Actively, by a chemical process, muscles contract. And that means that every muscle fiber, and there are thousands in any given muscle, every single fiber has the capability of making itself shorter and at the same time making itself wider in diameter because it's got a certain amount of mass and you can't squeeze it together. So muscles contract. The fibers contract by a chemical, a neurochemical process really. And when they contract, each muscle, you get then a contraction, and you can see this just by contracting your biceps. Do you flex your biceps? No. You flex a joint, but you contract a biceps. And you can see the muscle shorten and thicken. Now, when it does, everything around it has to glide. When it's contracting, it has to have the ability for its structures to move and not be restrained at either end. And so this is where the next step of the gliding occurs. This takes energy. Obviously, it requires a bit of blood flow in and out, in to bring in all the nutrients that it takes to make this contraction, and to take away the products of the contraction, the waste material, lactic acid being one of the most important ones, that which you build up too much of when you run too fast or pump too much iron, and then you get a fatigue right afterwards, often because it's too much lactic acid in the muscles that interferes with further contraction. It takes metabolic energy. Now, you take this movement, and as I mentioned before, the tendons on those muscles that have them will transfer this movement out to a distant end. The muscle that bends the very tip of your finger actually has its contracting portion right here in the forearm, and it has a tendon that extends from here all the way up to the tip of the finger to make it work. That's why you can get a lot of movement in a lot of small areas without the bulk of muscles. Efficiency. Somehow, that's the way we're put together, and it works quite well. We need these tendons, though, to glide smoothly. And tendons then have to have the capability of passing around the corner of joints. Think what's going on with these tendons around the wrist as I move it back and forth. Around these areas where the tendons are restricted, they have to be lubricated appropriately, and they have the same kind of lubrication that we see in the joints. This is called synovial tissue and synovial fluid, and this allows for the tendons to glide smoothly. As I mentioned before, muscles are arranged in groups and in layers, but specifically we're interested in those that go in multiple directions. For instance, if you flex your wrist, that's one range of movement, and muscles on this side of the wrist, forearm, supply that movement. Conversely, when you extend your wrist, it's muscles on the opposite side. If you contract both the flexors and the extensors at the same time, you get no movement. Everything's locked up. This is a condition called co-contraction. And listen for this later, because it's an important action in the potential development of difficulties. When one muscle moves one way, the flexors in this case are the agonist. And the opposite side, of course, is the antagonist. So there is the Greek version of it, although I don't think agony is a part of it unless you're hurting. So flexion and extension. Deviation of the wrist is not flexion and extension. Rotation is pronation and supination are other ranges of motion that come paired in opposite direction. Abduction and adduction. Ab, away from, says the Latin. Adduction, coming toward. That's why fingers can move sideways. Why it's possible for the alto saxophonist to feel comfortable when he or she moves to the baritone saxophone, or to reach into a 7th or 8th position on a stringed instrument. The joints. Remember I mentioned they had surfaces that allow you to move. These surfaces are what we call cartilage, and I think most people know what cartilage is. If you've ever looked at the end of a chicken bone, you're very familiar with it. This is very gristly, this is very smooth and slippery and slidey, and it minimizes the friction within the joint. These surfaces are lubricated, just like the tendons are in many areas, by synovial fluid. And this is produced by the lining of the joint. The lining of the joint being right next to this. And as you see, if I can get this mouse to work, right down here in the little hollow of the joint capsule, which holds the joint together and keeps the fluid in, the lining of this actually produces the fluid. So this is synovial tissue producing synovial fluid. Now, we mentioned the ligaments controlling the range of motion, just another view, and this happens to be the opposite side of that elbow that we saw. And again, ligaments on several sides to control the rotation and to control the flexion and extension. I'm not going to go into all the ranges of movement. That would be, assuming I got much less than an hour, we'll kind of stick with that. But the idea that these are things anatomically that people need to know about the musculotendinous system. As I mentioned, the nerves are the electrical organization of our body, and they basically connect our brain with distant structures. And these are out in the hands and the body and every place else. So it is the electrical system. Nerves serve two purposes. They serve sensory purposes and they serve motor or muscle purposes. And the sensory part of this begins at the sensation endings, be it in our fingertips, our tongue, our face, even in our gut. They have nerve endings that pick up either pain or distension or hot and cold or light touch or heavy touch or movement. And they send these impulses back to the brain where they're managed. And in some cases, we heard yesterday about the hot stove and the reflex of lifting off the hand. There is a motor activity that is involved, and that is the other side of this equation. The motor supply is an outgoing supply from the brain and spinal cord out to the other parts of the body, which, of course, are the muscles. And this is the thing that institutes contraction. I hope that makes some sense, and we'll be able to discuss a little bit further on this as we go later on. People in Performing Arts Medicine Association know that I've got a thing for words. And maybe because of heritage, but also because of some need for knowing that we all need to be on the same page. Unfortunately, a common language isn't really common. And this is one of the areas that we, as a multiplicity of groups with various backgrounds, have to talk about and ideally come to some kind of an agreement as to what various terms mean and various definitions and the usage of various words. The medical jargon, terminology, lexicon, whatever words you want to use. I don't like jargon because it indicates it may not be as solidly official as it should be. So let's just talk terminology. Is quite a bit different from that of the terminology of the musician. Many physicians don't know a lot of the specialized terms used in music, both in performance and theory, all other aspects of musician activities. Similarly, many musicians are not as familiar with some of the terms that we in the health profession use just glibly on a day-to-day basis. We all have our shorthand, we all have our contractions of our words, and as Winston Churchill once said about the English language, America and England are two countries separated by a common language. We have that, but ideally we can change that. We can come to some kind of a meeting of the mind. And I think for all of us, as we're trying to present this information and have it make sense, I think it's really incumbent upon us to use lay terminology as much as possible. Doc speak sounds good, and we can say what we want to each other very quickly with our own shorthand, but it may not mean a doggone thing to many of you folks. So to get understanding, we've got to stick with lay terminology as much as we can, but we still have to figure out that everybody needs to know some basic terminology. Now, most people get it through their everyday experiences at their own physician's offices, reading the media, and just talking to others. You pick up a lot of these terms. Ideally, we'd like them to be used as accurately as we can, and that's one of the other reasons that we're talking a bit about this. Some of the anatomy terms that I used earlier, I tried to keep relatively simple, and yet some of the terms, such as what a lining of a joint is, or what a tendon is, or what a ligament is, these are common enough terms that I think we all need to have some understanding of what they're about, and not just what they are, but in a sense what they do. So we're covering both anatomy and physiology in the same breath here, because you can't have structure without function or function without structure and really get anywhere in our area of endeavor. Now let's go beyond the ones that we've talked about. Let's talk about some ones that frequently are a source of confusion to a lot of people. And this is where a certain notoriety has come along regarding a difference of opinion from various countries and various individuals about how to use the word use. I've written 3 words there: overuse, misuse, and abuse. And to me, each one of these is different. Overuse means you're taking a normal structure and you're using it in a normal fashion, but to an extent that has exceeded its physiologic, its biologic capabilities. Normal function, normal structure, but too much. Misuse, the way I and quite a few others see it, indicates you are using a normal structure, but you're using it in a way that is perhaps, let's say, technically not acceptable. And this may mean grasping your instrument with a death grip. You talk about muscle tension, holding an instrument too tightly, holding a bow in an improper position to achieve what you want in a particular passage, and very many other things that, in a sense, we call technical errors, no, technical situations that may lead to difficulty. Abuse. We kind of got into a little of this this morning because we were talking about abuse of chemicals and other things. There can be physical abuse too. And the difference between overuse and abuse is that when you abuse a structure, as I see it and others, you're using this structure in a way that you know is going to be detrimental, but you do it anyway. Okay, that's the way, a way to consider these 3 terms. And they're very common terms. They're used all the time. as are these three. Everybody who has pain in the hand or the arm has either carpal tunnel syndrome or tendinitis. Oh, you know this already. Well, it ain't so. And we'll hear again more about why it ain't so very shortly. Itis, we heard yesterday, means inflammation of. Bursitis, arthritis. Tendinitis means a tendon is inflamed. Very often, for instance, where it hooks into the bone. Tennis elbow, anybody not heard of the phrase tennis elbow? Okay, it's a tendinitis. Right here, right where a tendon attaches to the bone, and it's an inflammation. And so tendinitis is appropriate for this particular area. If you have an area of the body where you don't have tendons, you can't have tendinitis. Duh. But you'd be surprised how often that term is used. Tenosynovitis, as you can see sitting between those other terms, is actually a combination of inflammation of the tendon and of those gliding structures, those synovial structures that cover it in the gliding areas. And that's kind of around the wrist, in the palm of the hand, occasionally up in the shoulder, but most commonly around the hand and wrist. Also in the foot and ankle, but we're not talking dance medicine here. This is mostly upper extremity. So inflammation of both of those together is called tenosynovitis. Subtract the tendon, and you get to a joint, like that shoulder I showed you, or the elbow, and if the joint is inflamed, it's called synovitis. Again, just taking the words and dividing them up a little. Sprain and strain, used interchangeably, but not really. And there's a small difference, but it's kind of good to know. Sprain with a P has to do with an injury to ligaments. A strain, a stretch, a partial tearing even, if you will, where some fibers may be torn. Sprain of ligaments. You've heard of all the football players that sprain their ACL, anterior cruciate ligament. Very common in many cases. And we get it more in the basis of trauma than anything else. Strain, on the other hand, with a T, indicates that a muscle is injured. And here usually it is an injury to the fleshy or contracting part of the muscle. And you can get muscles being torn there, or occasionally of a tendon. The torn Achilles tendon, again, a very severe athletic injury, is one that is officially a strain, and it is the most severe type of strain that Achilles tendon can have. So these are separations of terms that kind of are good to keep in the background. And time-wise, I guess I'm still under my hour, so I'd like to go ahead with the third section of this presentation, and that is non-music related injuries. Injuries that may affect both performance and practice, injuries that could affect people of all ages, all degrees of musical skill and involvement. And they can include such things as trauma or acute injury. Let me take a minute out here for a sidebar, as the journalists would say. To me, playing an instrument heavily and sustaining discomfort, to me, is not officially an injury. I trained as an orthopedic surgeon, so I was used to working with dislocated joints and broken bones and a lot of other semi-nasty stuff that I did for quite a few years. This is acute trauma, and to me, that is injury. So if you have an injury, to me, it's an acute process. Now, I know this may not be a totally held situation with everybody, but I prefer to call the things that musicians sustain in the practice room or wherever else from the physical basis, I prefer to call these conditions, not truly injuries. I'm not standing alone on this, but it's a point I try to keep separate when we deal in other areas of performing arts medicine with other performers who need to separate those two situations. Okay. After trauma, we do have some overuse problems that come from non-music related things. The day job was alluded to earlier and can be a source of difficulty. For instance, people who spend an inordinate or average amount of time on a computer for other than musical reasons are also likely to get it. And there are other problems that just seem to happen, lumps, developing various lumps, and developing infections as two circumstances that may affect the collegiate student. Arthritis also occurs, but I don't think that's appropriate for this age group. And so we really won't talk too much about degenerative conditions as it relates to our purpose here this weekend. But they are out there, and our senior population, those of us who are approaching maturity, are well aware of that. Let me present just a bit of my own experience in practice with somewhat over 1,300 patients aged 8 to 86 in these conditions. This is over a 13-year period. We see that there's a male preponderance, no, a female preponderance, but only very slightly in my particular practice. Now, each individual who is up here has an entirely different type of practice. One is collegiate internal medicine, one is general performing arts, and one is basically neurology with a lot of musicians included. My practice was as a hand surgeon. So each of us is going to see a slightly different population. So you can't compare my figures to Ralph's or Alice's or Dick's. But it gives you an idea of what does happen out there. We find that there is very definitely a youthful peak. We see this in the age group 10 to 19 that has by far the highest number, and yet still quite a bit in the years of professional music activity. I've divided the patients basically for statistical reasons into 6 groups, and you see them here. I don't have to read them to you. What our consideration is in this particular conference is Group C especially, but as it deals with our faculties, Group B, of course, is also involved. So as we look at some other statistics as we go along, we'll kind of watch for those particular areas. Here's one of those cross tabs. Really what I'd like to do is to show what we've got in the idea of various types of injuries. I'm working on your right side with my pointer here: arthritis, other problems, overuse problems, and trauma. If you notice in Group C, the major concern in your students is going to be trauma and overuse. Now, a lot of this is due to music, and we'll discuss that shortly. In the teaching professionals, we see that trauma still ranks high, but we get into some other difficulties too, some of which are age-related. Now, if we compare the various instrument classes by what instrument they play, you'll see that by far the highest ones are your keyboard and your string musicians. And this goes along, in a sense, with what Dr. Manchester had noted earlier, but this being a much wider group of patients. So we see that a lot of our Class F keyboarders are up there, and these are the group that we're not really involved with right now. This is the adult amateur, the so-called closet pianist, as several of my patients have described themselves. But that's what comes in the office. Let's look at trauma as it relates to how musicians are affected. Our students in Class E, now these are the younger students, and our amateur instrumentalists are really the high rollers in this one. More than half the patients, but definitely more than the average amount of trauma. Unlike Dr. Manchester's incidents, here you had a high prevalence in brass musicians. And we could discuss this from a lot of different angles for quite a while, but we'll pass that by. That's for 5 o'clock, I guess. Interestingly enough, of the trauma in my area, sports injury was the most common cause of injury. And of the sports, the highest percentage was ball sports. Yes, the Chicago Symphony in its summer sessions at Ravinia often would play softball in their breaks. And this is Chicago softball, played without gloves with a 16-inch ball. And it keeps a lot of us busy, as a matter of fact. But these things happen, and they happen very commonly. And of course, in a collegiate population, high school population, extremely common, be it intramural, be it pickup games, be it just general having fun. There's a lot of this that puts digits at risk. How do they happen? Sprains and strains, getting back to these two terms. Ligaments are sprained when you sprain a joint, you fall on the finger or have a ball hit your finger, and a jammed finger. Well, jam could be a lot of things. Could be fracture, could be sprain and strain. But sprain and strains by far were the greatest percentage of these. 25% were very high. Actually, a bit higher were fractures and dislocations. Now, what is dislocation? It means a joint goes out of joint. Simple. And it's not quite the dislocated shoulder that you find. They happen occasionally. Mostly it's finger injuries due to ball sports, but they are really quite common. Of all of those trauma patients that I had, and that was around 700 or so, 330, almost half were bone and joint injuries, fracture or dislocation. 25% were sprains and strains. Contusion and crush, trauma of a different variety, fall down, get a bruise, crush, get your finger caught in the door when it's closing, car door. I've done it. And these things, they're much smaller numbers, but they can be equally troublesome. Obviously, the fingertip, that which is at the extreme of a body, is most likely to be troubled. Probably the worst difficulty is open wounds. Remembering a pianist who was washing dishes, and a glass had broken in the sink. Oh, yeah. That's the exact response I get from most audiences. She had to have her major nerve for small muscles repaired in her hand. But 4 years later, she was playing Chopin again. It works, but these are the most serious things that we can come across, and the nerve that's completely lacerated and repaired never comes back to normal. It may be good, but it's never normal. Even tendon injuries have great difficulty in returning to full function. Maybe enough to play in many cases, and what may be enough motion for the right hand of a string player may not be nearly enough for the left hand as far as regaining motion. Finally, we talked about the cut tendons and nerves. Finally, there were late effects from old injury when patients treated elsewhere came to see me, and there's a lot of difficulty in this group. Overuse not from music. All overuse patients, more than 50% were from other sources. 2/3 of these were in keyboard players. Almost half are amateurs, but 25% were performing professionals. And the diagnoses of overuse, again, the same as we usually get before. Various degrees of inflammation, muscle tendon strains from the overuse process, and occasional nerve compressions. Not as many as other people see, but they're there. Now, if we go into other problems that are not overuse, here we see nerve compressions again, but this was in my adult patients, and here I saw a lot of carpal tunnel syndrome, 80% not from music. Most of these for the reasons that carpal tunnel shows up in a general non-musical population. So it can happen whether you play or not. But this was most of my carpal tunnel was non-music related. Lumps on the wrist, ganglions. I think many people have heard about these. Very common on the wrist, usually on the back, often in adolescents, more often in girls than boys. Can they interfere? Occasionally, but not the world's greatest difficulty. Some infections and various miscellaneous diagnoses complete the lot. In summary, let's say in relating to the idea of all of what I've discussed, not just the anatomy and the physiology, and not just these non-music related difficulties, young musicians are susceptible, as well as older. In the young group, musculoskeletal difficulties predominate, and especially from my experience and that of others too, involving the hand and upper extremity. These problems, as I mentioned before, are both related and unrelated to music. And finally, as we've been hearing before, the ability to get early information can lead to early treatment and ideally to prevention of so many of these difficulties. Thank you for your attention, and I'll turn things back to Ralph and our next speaker.
Next up, we're going to hear from Dr. Alice Branfenbrenner, who is going to talk about musculoskeletal problems. As you may know from reading the conference handbook, Alice was the founder of the Medical Problems at First of Musicians meeting in Aspen back in 1983. Which has since expanded to being the Medical Problems of Musicians and Dancers meeting, is now the official meeting of the Performing Arts Medical Association, of which Alice was the original president. We are very honored to have you here to give us the bottom line.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. And I thought maybe I would wake you up by giving a different format for the PowerPoint. Some of what I say will be scientific, some will be philosophical, some will tread on some other toes because in my practice of medicine, I find it difficult to keep the physical health and the mental, emotional health as separate entities. And some things will be reinforcing or repetitive of what Bill just told you. I'll try not to do too much. What we're all here to avoid or to try to have a better impression of 4 years of music education than this poor Juilliard student. I'm not going to give you a whole lot of statistics, but again, it puts into context a little bit of what I'm going to say afterwards, and I'm going to base my statistics on my experience over not quite 20 years of the clinic. I've had more like 35 years of taking care of musicians, but the clinic was formed in 1985, and we have seen in excess, when last counted, which was a few months ago, of some 3,000 patients, most of whom are musicians. And of those musicians, I can't give you the stats right off, but there are many more classical musicians than pop or jazz musicians, although we see significant numbers of those also. As you see, we see almost equal numbers of professionals and students, although within each of those populations, they're somewhat different. I see very few amateurs for obvious reasons. I just want to take a quick look at, and this is really not an all-inclusive list, although it's quite long, of the different risk factors that I evaluate actually every time I see a patient as to which one of these played a part in the reason that I'm seeing them and which ones I need to really pay attention to. I also, with Bill, don't like the term injury because it implies some disruption of tissue, and that's rarely the case. And a lot of these problems that we see, and I'll try to explain this as I go along, don't really fit the criteria that we were taught in medical school for various diagnoses or will jump out of the page of you at you from a textbook. But they're painful syndromes. So I tend to call them muscle tendon pain syndromes because that's the tissue that's involved in hurting. I also don't like to use the term overuse as a diagnostic category because it doesn't tell me what tissue I'm talking about. It certainly tells you how they got there, and practically everything we see is overuse in one form or another. So these are my own little hang-ups. The order of these risk factors is in no particular order. I probably, if I were to think about it closely, would put instrument first and stress second. They're both important. Gender certainly appears to be a risk factor, although, and I'll show you the stats for the student population, among my professional population, for some reason or other, and I don't understand it because it's different from everyone else's, but my males are almost equal to my female professional musicians. It's not true of the students at all. So I don't know what that is about my Chicago musicians, but anyhow. Technique can or cannot be a risk factor. Sometimes people who play with the most elegant looking technique have the most problems, and people who use the most unorthodox, seemingly perhaps unergonomic technique don't have any problems. But it's certainly one of the things we look at, and there certainly are, you know, if it's not broke, I don't fix it. But when I see someone that's doing something that looks like it's really going to potentially be a real bomb for them, I point it out. Practice time. It's not just the total hours of practice, it's how they spend that practice time. It's how intensively they practice. When they're practicing, when musicians are practicing for an event, it tends to be a much more stressful practice period than if they're just practicing and having a kind of a good time doing it. If they practice without taking breaks, it tends to be riskier than if they practice even a longer total time but take multiple breaks during the time that they're practicing. So we inquire a lot about how you do your practicing. Repertoire makes a big difference. In certain instruments more than others, but certainly in keyboard players we see many more problems in general with people who've been playing repertoire that involves a lot of chords or a lot of sequences of octaves than with passage work. So we at least ask about the repertoire. You know, certain minimalist music, playing Philip Glass for the Chicago Lyric Opera a number of years ago was a risk factor, even though the notes were repetitive. But every other measure, the tempo changed. General conditioning has a lot to do with one's resistance to injury. Being a couch potato or being whatever the equivalent would be, spending all your time in the practice room, doesn't generally build up appropriate good muscle support of the bigger muscles. So that people, musicians who spend 8 hours a day practicing and 6 hours in class don't have much time left over for general maintenance work, and they need to do it. The older you get, the more you need to do that. Just because a person is a musician doesn't mean that a problem they're having at the instrument, even painful, came from the instrument. And it has happened more times than I care to think about, that the initial symptom of either a general medical condition or a neurological condition first manifests itself as a problem playing the instrument, because you as musicians are exquisitely sensitive to minor decrements in your function, so that a symptom may show up there. So we as physicians have to recognize the fact that just because you walk in the door as a musician, we don't immediately say, you have carpal tunnel syndrome, without looking at the patient. These diseases do happen. Stress is probably, as I said, should be along, maybe even ahead of instrument. As was already said, when one is under a great deal of stress, or I guess it was this morning, one tends to have greater muscle tension. And if you're having greater muscle tension and you're trying to work those muscles just as hard, despite the fact that those muscles are progressively getting shorter and shorter because they're so tight, you're more likely to injure yourself. You become less aware of what you're doing and protecting your body and less in touch with your body when you're under a lot of stress because you're preoccupied. So that's a very important factor, and we'll talk a lot about that in a little while. And the individual characteristic of the musician may or may not be a risk factor. A very tall pianist is almost as much risk as a very tiny pianist because they have too much body. Small fingers, hyper-extensible fingers, which I will talk about in a couple of minutes. All these different characteristics of how the person is put together, both psychologically and physically, may or may not be risk factors. Now, in particular in relation to music students, what are the factors that really that we have to pay special attention to? particularly freshmen, but also, as someone pointed out this morning, as they get to senior year and they're faced with going out into the cruel world and there's no job out there. There are particular parts of the school environment that may be very threatening. But we, at Northwestern, having just welcomed a new class of freshmen, I'm particularly aware of the freshman problems. It's a whole new ball game, and someone pointed out this morning that someone that was Principal Viola back, and I can't remember the name of the school you used, may be last chair if in the orchestra. These are hard things to accept, and in addition to the fact that you're having to accept them without the benefits of a lot of maturity. Hopefully during the time you're in the school, the students are in the school, we help them develop. But these are kids, and I do call them kids, who are undergoing all the same developmental, frequently adolescent type issues as people who are not in music school without being under the same kind of stress that they are to the degree that we put them through in music schools. There was an article in the New York Times several months ago, and actually I wrote a part of an editorial about it, on the front page from a number of liberal arts schools in New England, pointing out that they had come to realize that the degree of stress that they were putting under their students under seemingly had a lot to do with stress-induced illnesses of a variety of sorts, so that they were going to go back and examine how they were putting their students under stress and to try to give them various means of, first of all, reducing the stress, and also help them in coping techniques. And all I can think of is this is going on in liberal arts schools. Can you imagine how much more stress we're putting them under in the conservatories? New teachers. The whole teacher-student relationship is potentially a can of worms and potentially also a wonderful relationship. But these are things that can contribute to illness, injury, stress for a student. Unfortunately, not every student and every teacher are a good match for each other. And it's usually you, the teachers, that have to take the greater responsibility in trying to make these relationships work. But they also are a major contributor to student stress and ultimately then to students' injuries. Competition. Some students thrive on competition, other students fold under competition. Some schools are much more competitive in the way they run the school than other schools. Not every school is the right school for every student, just like every teacher is not the right teacher for every student. But competition for some students is a very major risk factor. Students who are asked or required to participate in multiple ensembles at the same time, playing in the regular orchestra, playing in a band, playing in a pit orchestra for the opera, playing in various chamber music ensembles, and having to put together a senior recital. No professional would try to do that, and for students particularly, that frequently is just too much playing. There are non-music classes, depending on the conservatory. I work at Northwestern, where our students are required to take a fair number of classes in the liberal arts school in addition to the music classes. But even regular conservatories, there are a lot of obligations, and students frequently, particularly the younger students, have not learned to apportion their time well and may get in trouble because of that. So I took a look at the ages of people who we took care of who were listed as students, and you see that the graduate students don't get as much trouble as the younger students. And it peaks during the years that they are with us in conservatories, from 19 to 25 or 24. And this is a way of looking at, I didn't identify the separate instruments as nicely as Ralph did, but by instrumental group and by gender. And you see that, first of all, you see the preponderance, particularly in the string players, and to a slightly lesser extent in the keyboard players, of females in this group. Tremendous. I mean, if you look at the overall group, it's twice as many females as males. When you get down to the brass, obviously there are there are not a whole lot of them anyhow, because they get in trouble less, but more males. The preponderance, the huge preponderance of females in the woodwinds, I think is due to all those lady flute players. Now, this is a somewhat complicated slide because some of these are overlapping, but we keep a database of all the patients we've seen, and in certain ones we'll star one diagnosis, and sometimes they're somewhat equal diagnoses. So some of these are double and some of these are single, but I tried to pick the ones where we had starred a single most important diagnosis. And the most frequent diagnoses were these people who didn't quite fit the category or the criteria for diagnosis for tendinitis or for something more specific that I ended up calling pain syndromes. And you can see that those were the largest number, followed half of as many by those who had the discrete findings of tendinitis or tenosynovitis, which I've pushed together. Some we identified as having pain strictly from muscle tension. A tight muscle gives you pain. I mean, you all know what a Charlie horse is. To a lesser degree of muscle tension than a Charlie horse, a tight muscle will cause pain by itself, just for being tight. Laxity refers to joint laxity or double jointedness, and I'll discuss that again a little bit more later because I think it's an important finding, particularly in conservatory students. We don't have a whole lot of nerve entrapments in this age group. Many more later, but again, carpal tunnel is not as common as it's reputed to be in the general population. As it is not, carpal tunnel has been overplayed in the media, let's put it that way. So there were 78 people who had carpal tunnel. Virtually none of those came to surgery, I might add. Now, over in the right-hand column are, again, numerically not a huge number, but people who I think are very important for us to pay attention to. The 69 with depression had primary depression. That was their major problem that they came in with. Also some pain, but the depression was primary. The depression can be cart, the depression can be horse, but in any case it needs treatment, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's a strong relationship between pain syndromes and depression. Stress, we've talked about. Stress as a diagnosis means they were just stressed out, basically. Chronic pain are people who have had muscle tendon pain syndromes that have gone on over a period of time and don't get better for a variety of reasons, frequently because there's coexistent depression, which has not been attended to. Anxiety, diffuse anxiety, say, can exist by itself. It can exist in combination with depression. But again, it needs to be paid attention to along with whatever else is going on in the musculoskeletal system. Of these students, only 31 came in with trauma, Bill. So I don't know whether I hate to think that we're protecting our students so much that they don't get a chance to traumatize themselves, because I think they should be exercising. I'd rather they were risk takers in this department. And deconditioning by itself was a rather small group, but there are those people who just have these terrible bodies, and we need to do something about them. One of the sites most commonly that we saw musculoskeletal pain syndromes, most commonly in the forearms, followed by the wrists, hands, fingers, shoulders, and upper arms. The neck and upper back are common sites of where we hold our tension, as the patients will say. You tighten up like that, and then if you're tight up here, you don't have a prayer of a chance of having well-functioning forearms. We do see low back pain in people, particularly in double bass players, but in the general population, it's rampant as it is in musicians in general. We saw jaw pain, particularly in our brass players, but to a lesser extent in the woodwind players. Not all jaw pain is TMJ, although they may come in with that diagnosis, and it's an important distinction. And other embouchure problems, including dental problems. Now, Bill has given you elegant diagnoses, so I don't have to go through this, of tendinitis and tenosynovitis. I tend to treat them as one and the same because, in general, it's pretty hard to tell the difference if one is by itself. There is always an element of the other, I think, with the one. The locations that we saw them in tended to be virtually anywhere, but most frequently from the elbow on down. We did see occasional tendinitis in the biceps, tendons, the upper arm, or occasionally in the rotator cuff area. But most commonly among students, we saw it in the elbow. And where do we see it in the elbow? Most commonly in the lateral side, the thumb side of the elbow. Why that? Because in general, these muscles, the flexor muscles that you go down on keys with or on strings with, are much stronger than the muscles that pull up off the strings or the keys. So that even under ordinary circumstances, the extensors have a fair amount of work to do in opposing the agonist muscles of the flexors. But when there's the least bit of added tension, and so you're going down even harder on the keys, then the extensors have even harder job. And so where does the overuse of that muscle manifest itself? When the muscle gets shorter and shorter because it's under tension, at the where it inserts here, where the tension is greatest at the epicondyle, on the lateral side of the elbow there. De Quervain's tendinitis is a particular location of tendinitis which tends to be one of the more difficult to treat because it involves the thumb tendons. And it can involve either the abductor tendon, the tendon that helps you move the thumb away from the hand, or the extensor, which helps you move your thumb up. And because we use our thumbs for so many activities, including what we're doing in music, it is very difficult sometimes to eradicate that. It takes longer than most other kinds of tendinitis to take care of. Trigger fingers are fingers where, in this meaning, there is usually a little nodule on the flexor tendon or tendon sheath that prevents the gliding through of your flexor tendon, so that when you flex your finger down, it won't, and try to extend it up, the tendon will not glide and it's stuck down. Much more common in the older population than in student populations. We do see flexor tendinitis occasionally in musicians in general and students in particular, but much less commonly than extensor. So what about this group that don't fit any criteria very nicely? We can't give a nice label to. I would tell you that I do label them as tendinitis for the benefit of the insurance companies, because I want my students' bills to get paid, and tendinitis is something that insurance companies understand and compensate. But literally, it's hard sometimes to give that definition. Which patients do I have trouble doing that with? When there is not a particular location of pain that is predictable, where I can't feel anything thickened, or there is no local tenderness, it's here, there, and the other place. There is a tendency for when people begin to feel pain in one location to have a kind of a spreading of pain. And that's why we have to take a kind of careful history about where was it that you first felt the pain, and under what circumstances. And those are questions we ask. Were you playing when you first noticed it? Was it after playing? Many, many times musicians have no pain while they're playing and have it only afterwards. And that's because I think the adrenaline is going and they're preoccupied with playing, and then they stop and they suddenly realize they were in pain. But these pain syndromes that don't fit the criteria tend to be in varying locations and to have varying qualities of pain. One of the questions we ask patients when they're in pain is to try to describe what it feels like. Does it feel burning? Does it feel like an electrical sensation? Is it an aching, throbbing pain? And with these patients, you'll find, well, sometimes it's one or it's all of the above, and it just doesn't fit a nice pattern for us. And these syndromes, these pain syndromes, are disabling to varying extents within the same individual even. Sometimes they can play, sometimes they can't play. Very unpredictable. Now, I told you I was going to talk about joint laxity. Any joint can be somewhat more hypermobile than normal. It tends to be somewhat genetic in nature, and the reason that the joints are more hypermobile is because the ligaments that Dr. Dawson told you about attaching to form the joint capsule, basically, or to attach the muscle, have greater elasticity than normal. There's just more stretch in them, so that it allows greater range of motion than is normal. And if I look at the finger joints of certain musicians, I will find that instead of stopping at 180 degrees, as my fingers do, certain joints will bend back considerable degrees. Much more common in women, more common in Asian women, but occurs in men also. And in the average population, it probably exists to about 6 to 8%. Now, I will show you that in my population, it exists in a much larger percentage. And what I do is that I look at, when patients come in pain, we go over them, and what I have found through all the years of practicing is that there's a significant increased number of patients who have coexistent hypermobile finger joints and pain of various sorts. Now, why is this? Several reasons. One, in the rheumatologic literature, which I think Bernie Rubin would agree, years ago in England, in clinics there was described this so-called benign laxity syndrome, where people came into the clinics with rheumatologic type complaints, joint aching, joint pain, and no positive rheumatologic tests, but marked hypermobility of the joints. And it simply means that there's more wear and tear over the joints. And you do that over a number of years, and then this may mean really greater wear and tear. But in the short term, people who have hypermobile joints will have occasional joint pain, very much like having arthritis in a way. Now, if you're a musician and you have joints, finger joints that are hypermobile, and you want to go down on a key or a string, and your brain knows, even if you don't consciously know, that there's a tendency for that joint to collapse, you're going to use, to compensate for that laxity, greater degrees of muscle tension. So that then, if you look back, it isn't that great a surprise that musicians who happen to have this kind of joint get in more trouble than do patients who don't have these hypermobile joints. Now, for years, and there are still some people that would dispute this, but most of us who see a lot of patients, I think, are in agreement about this. Some people used to feel that, and they cited Paganini, that having greater mobility of these joints allowed for greater skill in getting around the instrument. That may be. You certainly, if you have a hypermobile joint at the end of your finger, your MP of your fifth finger, and your pianist, you can get a greater span than you would if you didn't have that hypermobility, but at some expense. So year after year, I find somewhere in the area of 20% of my patients who have musculoskeletal pain syndromes have coexistent hypermobility. What do you do about it? We can't repair the joints. You become aware that it is a problem. You try to not allow yourself to compensate with too much greater tension to stabilize your hands. You try to maybe adjust your repertoire, and you try to adjust your technique so that you're not putting the extra strain on these joints that is going to make you tend to overextend the joints. What about deconditioning, which is something else, even though I only showed you, I think 10% of the patients had that as a problem, but as a major problem. But for most music students, it is a problem because they just don't have time to exercise, and we've got to give them the time to do it. They don't exercise. They frequently, if they do exercise, will do the wrong kind of exercising, such as pumping iron, which tends to build big, tight muscles and not the kind of muscles they need. They need to be marathon runners. They will have had some kind of music-related, quotes, injury, and so they back off and they're scared to use their bodies. The way they use their instrument, for instance, a string player who uses their bodies in such unequal ways, right versus left, tends to conduce them to have strangely built bodies, if you will, and the more need to equalize the strength. Schedules do not allow them to get out there and do things. Their practice habits, their poor posture while they're practicing, as well as their poor posture unrelated to the instrument, their general health, and they're depressed, some of them, so that they don't have the energy to go and do exercising. We've got to see that they get some. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. Now, a certain number of the patients that we see who come in with musculoskeletal pain will go on to develop a so-called chronic pain syndrome. Chronic pain syndromes exist in non-musicians as well as musicians, and they are something that we as physicians don't like to see because they're very difficult to treat. These are people whose pain goes on beyond the meaning of the original pain. You get a pain syndrome, or you have a painful problem, it usually means that something has gone wrong, at least initially. But when we have removed the source of the original pain, and 6 months, a year and a half go by, and this is not an exaggeration, and the pain goes on, there's something else you've got to look at. And basically, the pain has developed a life of its own, and there are neurochemical reasons for this happening, but it needs to be treated differently than we treat people with an acute pain. Now, one of the reasons, what are the risk factors for people developing those? People who've had a lot of histories of injuries and pain problems in the past kind of sets off a red flag. I didn't put it in the list here, but people in whose families there's a history of a lot of pain syndromes makes you wonder about it. Recent changes in life unrelated to music or music, recent divorces, recent loss of significant others, new teachers, general upsetting can be a risk factor. Ongoing stress, persistent long-term stress, depression and anxiety are risk factors. And again here, in chronic pain, almost everyone who has pain gets somewhat depressed, but the other way around also applies. People who are depressed are more at risk for developing pain. General health factors. If you're just generally not terribly healthy, you're more likely to develop chronic pain. The iatrogenic means that we as physicians have participated in this occurring. And I think this is a complicated thing, and I was going to talk about it more when I talk about treatment. There is a tendency among some of our colleagues to overtreat rather than undertreat some of the problems that we see in musicians. Most of the problems we see in musicians don't take a rocket scientist to treat them. They don't take fancy treatment. They take proper assessment, looking at all the risk factors, seeing that we're treating all of the things that need to be treated, but not over-treating. Don't incapacitate these people beyond what needs to be, because that increases the level of anxiety and the incapacitation of these people. If you take a musician away from music, that's what they're there to do. And if they weren't depressed beforehand, they will be depressed after that in most cases. So you're creating something that need not exist in most instances, and I'll go into it a little bit more later. But I do believe that some of the chronic pain syndromes that have occurred because of us as physicians. The other reason that we have participated unwittingly, perhaps, in this is that when musicians don't find a ready answer for one physician, they tend to go to another physician, particularly for these kind of pain syndromes. And the tendency is for each physician to rework up this patient. The more this happens, the more the symptoms go on, and we really we're not helping the patient with this kind of ongoing workup. Now, the other thing that occasionally is responsible on an unconscious level for the development of chronic pain syndromes is what I call an alternative agenda. That is, as you know, musicians are frequently labeled as musicians from a very early age, and they get tracked into going on into music as a profession and on into our conservatories without ever really carefully examining the alternatives. And I think because musicians' own egos and self-value are so tied up with being musicians, the idea that maybe they're not going to be a musician becomes such a threatening thing that it is very hard to make a conscious decision. You know, maybe I made a mistake. I'm going to go off and be a pre-med or a law student or what have you. So that sometimes, I don't believe ever it's conscious, but that sometimes it is an unconscious way of finding an alternative career. And we have to recognize this as a possibility and help them to understand it and gracefully move on to something else. How do we treat these people? It is very important that we make an accurate diagnosis. Both Bill and I have kind of joked about the fact that carpal tunnel gets diagnosed inappropriately very often, but unfortunately it also gets operated on, supposedly, with a frequency that horrifies me when it isn't a diagnosis. That's the worst case scenario, but it is important to understand what we're treating before we treat it. We need to assess all the things that have participated in causing the problem and treat them all. I strongly believe that we need to reduce playing rather than, except in very few instances, stop people from playing. I think if you have students play 5 or 10 minutes a day or several times a day, that is going to do them much more benefit in the long term than totally resting them for, say, 2 or 3 weeks. I will occasionally take students out from playing, but really relatively rarely for a week or so, but not much longer than that, because I think the benefits of having them stay involved to some extent to keep their chops up and to keep their spirits up so that they don't become total invalids is much more important than any loss that possibly could occur from playing a short while. I do modify the amount that they play. We've already talked about avoiding undertreatment or overtreatment. You have to be specific in individual cases. Exercise, general exercise, I've talked about a lot. We need to sometimes strengthen specific muscles in order to avoid stresses. Sometimes the muscles that hold the shoulder blades in are poorly developed, and this causes extra stress on the rest of the arm. We need to evaluate that and attend to properly treating that person. We need to give them proper medical support. We need to give them academic support, believe them when they're having a problem. And we need to see that their families support them, which frequently is a problem. Well, I often have students coming in and say, if I can't play, my family will be so disappointed in me. This is a real issue. And it is very difficult for students to get better when they have a pending senior recital on their minds. Deadlines are odious for recovery. We use pain medications. We use them acutely and not on a long-term basis. We generally use combination pain and anti-inflammatory. Many patients are reluctant to take pain medications because they think it's going to mask something and they may hurt themselves further. However, real severe pain is going to come through any Advil treatment that we could possibly use. And allowing reduction of pain will assure to a certain extent that students or patients will not use muscles inappropriately in order to self-splint an injury. When you have a problem, if you have a sore ankle, you walk funny, so you limp. You're more likely to injure the other leg as a result of the limping. So we don't, on the arms, want to do comparable things. So if you relieve the pain, they frequently will play more, use their muscles more normally. The anti-inflammatory effect is extremely important, and you only get that if you take a certain sustained level of these drugs over a period of time. I strongly advise against invasive treatments. I rarely use injectable cortisone. I certainly do not believe in using it as the first order of business in most what turn out to be relatively minor problems. There are downsides to the use of cortisone, particularly over a period of time, sequential injections, and it is not the first order of business. Very few of my patients and practically none of my student patients come to surgery. We generally advise the use of ice for most of these things because there's an inflammatory component to most of the things we see. Heat is comforting and good for muscle spasms, but not in general for these kind of things that occur as a result of overuse. I use splinting when I really need to put a part to absolute rest, but I don't use splinting all day long. I try to use it intermittently. Using splinting at night is safe, and you don't, if you splint apart for a week, you get loss of muscle substance. So then you have to make up for the muscle loss as well as for the injury. We use physical therapy and occupational therapy. I will tell you that in general, we have problems when we send musicians to sports medicine facilities because their repertoire tends to be somewhat limited and not attend to what students or musicians generally need. It is rarely a question of needing general overall strengthening for musicians. It is endurance strength, yes, but not brute strength. And athletic facilities tend to look to strengthening as the panacea for all problems. I use Feldenkrais and Alexander for my patients frequently, but not until they've been evaluated medically. I think that these are very useful as adjunctive. They're not typically medically therapeutic, but they certainly give, with a good Feldenkrais or Alexander teacher, you can get a kind of body awareness that frequently is very helpful to many students. But again, it has to be done after the person has been evaluated medically so that we're sure that there is not some specific treatment that's needed. Stretching is something that everyone should do, both to some extent before practicing, but certainly after practicing. Musicians do very well with yoga, unless they get very competitive about it, which sometimes they do. Swimming, as I said, is something that I think everyone should do. You get more bang for your buck out of swimming than any other exercise you can do, and it's particularly good for musicians because it does give musicians the kind of strengthening they need in terms of endurance strengthening and flexibility. Stress reduction by whatever means necessary is certainly important, and the use of antidepressants in a number of different ways. Certainly, if one is treating a primary depression or a reactive depression, sending these patients to be appropriately treated by psychiatrists and psychotherapists is important, and frequently the use of the antidepressants is helpful. We also, with chronic pain, use minor doses of one of the more old-fashioned antidepressants very successfully as a nighttime medication to kind of deepen the sleep level, which seems to, in a neurochemical way, affect the pain perception process. And for chronic pain patients, it works extremely well. Doctor-patient relations is another issue that perhaps I should be talking to my colleagues about and not to you. But you should understand that students in general, and music students in particular, require sometimes the patience of Job to take care of and to attend to. And Ralph, I think, could speak to this probably for days. You have to listen to them, you have to cajole them, you have to understand their hang-ups and give them your total attention. I use every patient interaction as an opportunity for patient education, students and older patients. I think it's an opportunity not to be missed. I do think that musicians in general could take a lot more responsibility for their own care if they understood how the human body works. And if I have time later, I'll be happy to tell you about the courses that we run up at Northwestern Music School towards this end. I think a lot of times music students in particular need reassurance that whatever has happened to them is not going to mean an end to their career, and that you will see to it with their help that they will be back to functioning normally. Patients in general are scared stiff when they come to see doctors, and we need to pay attention to that, but students in particular. Frequently when they come to see us, and I think Ralph will agree, it's their first independent approach to a doctor, and they don't know quite how to deal with it. And it's a great opportunity for us to teach them that going to the doctor isn't a terribly threatening, in fact, can be a helpful visit. Encourage them to ask questions. They frequently want to get out of there because they're scared. Give them a chance to ask questions and give them a way to follow up. I give practically all my patients my email address, and it gives them a feeling that if they've forgotten or are too shy to ask something, they can write back and ask about it afterwards. when we deal with them, I tell them that recovery is rarely a straight line event. There are going to be ups and downs, so that when they feel a little better one day, they don't get too elated, and they feel a little worse the next day, they don't go down in the dumps. But that is true, that rarely do these people recover like that from these things, up and down. And if they know that's going to happen, then they don't panic. I'm absolutely honest with everything I tell them. I also tell them that I am their advocate, that I will not talk to their teachers unless they want me to talk to their teachers, and if their teachers call me and I do not have the students' permission to talk to them, I will not tell them anything. This is extremely important, aside from litigation. You'll never get them back if you violate their confidence. And I give them a way of maintaining contact beyond the email. I frequently try to get them to come back, whatever the interval I think is appropriate, so that they have a way of coming back and showing me how they're doing. Now, this is a little audacious, but these are some of my suggestions for areas that I think that you all need to think about in terms of long-term reducing the incidence of problems in students. I think you need to look at all the areas where problems have arisen among your student body, individually and collectively. Sometimes it's the studio, sometimes it's the individual student, sometimes it comes from an orchestra situation, but you need to have your ear to the ground and have particularly if you're an administrator, have an open door policy where you have some regular interaction with students so you know what's going on in different kinds of groups of students. Obviously, you need to do that with your faculty too. But students need to be able to communicate, and you need to get the information from students, not second or third hand from some teacher, but you need to know what's going on in order to be able to do something about it. You need to honestly evaluate whether there is too much stress in the environment and in what areas you can best reduce it and how you're going to do it. You need to look at the role that your faculty has in both reducing stress among the individual groups of students and increasing it. One of the things I learned very early in my tours of duty in Aspen for 9 years was that there were certain studios from whom I saw recurrent injuries and certain studios where I never saw students. Now, I assume it wasn't that the teacher was keeping them away from me. I think that some teachers, not intentionally, I'm sure, but for one reason or another, generate more problems than others. One of the things I think you need to do is to evaluate admissions policy. We at Northwestern this year are doing a prospective study of the entire freshman class, which we're going to follow through the years, and see what it is that happens as they go through, rather than looking backwards, and see whether maybe there's some problems that we need to look at and who we've admitted or how we've handled them as they've come in. But some students maybe would do better in other schools, and I think that one has to be very careful if you're having a lot of problems to see whether those are the students that have gotten in problems. I think we've all talked about incorporating various kinds of health classes in the curriculum. I think it can be done relatively easily without a lot of expense, and I think that there are different kinds of classes that you can run for music educators and for performers, but I think there needs to be some formalized form of education, both of the students and of the faculty, and you need to give them time to exercise. This is a little proselytizing. We're the only act in town, so I feel that I can do this. This is, in case you don't know it, the Medical Problems of Performing Artists. We started in 1986. It is now the official journal of the Performing Arts Medicine Association. It is peer-reviewed. Every article that is published has been reviewed and frequently revised, but it's reviewed by at least 2 peer reviewers. We have an artistic board as well as a scientific editorial board. Many of the articles, some of the articles, musicians would not understand. Many of them you would understand all of, and some of them you would understand part of. But I think that people that read it have found it helpful, and I would hope that you would try it out. And this is the ultimate form of prevention. I don't recommend this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. You've all been very attentive. You've had a ton of information thrown at you. We're doing quite well with respect to staying on schedule, and if it's okay with Dick, I would offer you a 10-minute break before we start that, but I am going to introduce Dr. Letterman in 10 minutes, so please return.